topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart.
Hello and welcome to It's Your Voice, the show that hosts enriching conversations in diversity. My name is Bahia Yaxline. I'm a core alignment coach, an emotional wisdom training specialist, and a diversity, equity, inclusion trainer, facilitator, educator, which have spent most of my career doing the diversity awareness work and how to step out of patterns of bias that harm other people, which actually harms all of us. And I have a website if you're interested in looking at some of the ways I design classes and trainings for organizations, groups, how I coach individuals. Beyond this topic, but this is where my heart lies. And you can find my programs at my website, knowwhatyouwantcoaching.wordpress.com. And that's a good way to contact me if you're interested in having me help you co-create a training that fits your staff, your demographics, whoever you serve. I really enjoy the co-tailoring process and designing a training that will work for you and make life more inclusive and better for everyone. So today we have the topics of cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. This is so relevant. So timely. It's been happening, of course, for generations. But I have a really fun, special teacher, one of my favorite teachers in the world with me today, Aaron Furtek, who teaches 8th grade U.S. history at a junior high school. Aaron, thank you so much for being here today. Come on in.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Bahia, for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Well, I mean it. You're just an incredible teacher, and luckily I get to observe your class, and I know that you happen to be talking about these topics and teaching about these topics in your classes at a junior high school, which you can talk about also if you want to.
Sure. No, sorry. Go on.
No, I was just, and it's just also the fact that we're looking at the U.S. is looking at midterm elections. It's also timely, and I appreciate that your classes, along with the whole history department, is helping making sure students understand democracy and how it works. So we'll just move from one of those topics to the other. And
sure.
Yeah. And I just want to mention one thing you said that we can talk about again a little bit later in our conversation is I heard you point out to students that we often forget everything we learned about how the government works. At least in America, I know. So anyway, that's a sweeping generalization, but also really common. So I'm really glad we're having this discussion today. Yeah. So I will start with just defining what I mean when I say cultural appropriation, and please feel free to add or expand to the definition, but I think it's really helpful when people know, like, okay, what does somebody mean by that term? So I think of it as when a group of people who do not belong to a culture will take an element or a practice from a different culture that's not theirs, kind of out of context, and use it for their own benefit. And they might think, oh, well, we're just appreciating them. But it's particularly when it's members or of a dominant culture taking an element or practice from a culture that has experienced oppression by the dominant culture systemically over since the beginning of our country. That it can really hurt. It can hurt children and adults in ways that we may not realize or we may not think about. And I think that's sometimes how we keep perpetuating stereotypes, because we're not thinking and we haven't been taught critical thinking yet. As you're teaching now, or we're not remembering how often and how frequently we could be inadvertently doing cultural appropriation. So do you want to add to that definition?
Yeah, no, I mean, you hit all the excuse me, you hit all the points pretty much on the head. Yeah, it's when a majority group adopts certain aspects of a minority group in a way that really furthers stereotypical aspects, either in an exploitative way or in an ignorant way. Just they truly don't understand what the culture is representing in impactful ways, and are just furthering stereotypes of that culture, either for their own benefit or through ignorance, any which way. And so something that I always like to point to is Rastafarianism. If a lot of cultural appropriation happens through that culture, and a lot of it, people just think it's dreadlocks, reggae music, and smoking marijuana. When in reality, like that really are very minor parts of that culture itself. And if you actually did look at the culture itself, while marijuana use is part of their culture, if you actually know about it, it has to do with reading religious texts in an altered state of mind, in a way where you can actually interpret their religious beliefs. It's not a lifestyle choice necessarily. And so that is one I always like to bring up a lot, is that kind of a culture. So your definition is 100% working and fantastic. I actually really liked what you had to say there. Where cultural, I'm sorry, I hope I'm not dropping the gun with going into cultural appropriation, or do you want to say that for later? Appreciation.
Yeah, let's kind of draw out a little bit more about the appropriation first.
Sure.
And I really appreciate your adding how much it reinforces stereotypes, and frequently it is done out of ignorance. But I want to also mention that sometimes we just ignore what people say. There are many indigenous groups who have pointed out exploitation when some of their spiritual practices have been learned by members of not their group, usually. Sure. And I think that it has occurred less because people did speak out. But again, I'm not taking tabs on all the occurrences of exploitation of, Native American practices or other indigenous practices. But when you explicitly know, or you have been told, or you've been confronted and said that's you don't understand the pipe ceremony. It's not from your heritage. You don't know our history. You haven't lived the lives we live. It's not only not fully informed from experience and one's own tradition, but also sometimes it's not even acknowledged, or it's acknowledged as if I'm an expert on it, which of course I'm not. If I learned it, as an adult at some kind of workshop or something. So sometimes I know it happens even when we know well, and we decide for some reason or another we rationalize or justify.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what comes with that as well is the consequences of the cultural appropriation is potentially a mass misrepresentation of what the culture itself is all about. And so not only are you appropriating this culture, but you're spreading misinformation about these people, their beliefs, and why they do what they do. And so I think that's overlooked a lot, where a lot of people say that's cultural appropriation. You're really doing something bad. Like, sure, that is without a doubt a reality, but the underlying issue is, what does that do to the culture overall? And I think a lot of people overlook that part as well, where we just kind of stop with, you're potentially being racist, possibly ignorant, possibly, offensive, most likely, if not guaranteed. And they stop there, where you've angered a people by insulting their culture. But the real issue is how mass cultural appropriation will misrepresent this to people who maybe are interested in this culture, or learning about this culture, or know nothing about this culture, who now have this information to go on. And that can cause a lot of not just a lot of misinformation about these people, and so that can do a lot of damage going forward. And we've seen this a lot, like you said, especially with Native Americans. A lot of me growing up, for example, I thought that they all lived in teepees and had headdresses and did rain dances and things of the like. And so what you can do early on, unfortunately, is misinform kids or adults into believing this. And if they don't continue their education on this culture or people, that's just going to be the reality of them going forward. And so they don't actually have a good understanding of the functions of these people in terms of culture, in terms of religion, or what have you. And so that's something that I feel gets overlooked a lot, and I wanted to bring some attention to.
I really appreciate that. And I know that you and your colleague, Mr. Lagunas, and that whole department spend more and more time, it seems like to me, every year, expanding how much the students are asked to learn about Indigenous cultures in America, who was here before, and look how many people were here before, look how many people were annihilated, and tell us, like, get to know and see the differences. And I really appreciate that, because I honestly don't know of course, I'm not in, examining other schools around the country. But I honestly doubt that has become, I think it's part of an effort to decolonize the curriculum. So I really appreciate that, like, deeply. And I think the students do too. And they walk away learning so much more than I think has happened to any previous generations.
I like to hope so. And first of all, thank you so much for your kind words. That is very much what me and Mr. Laguna and Mr. Wizard as well are trying to do. And really everyone for the record, I work at Da Vinci Junior High School, and everyone at Da Vinci Junior High School, I think, is trying to put forward there is a revisionist history, because I never learned about this sort of stuff growing up. I was taught, from what I remember at least, is that, Christopher Columbus came here. Native Americans had bad immune systems, and so they died. And that, eventually, I did learn about the Trail of Tears, but that was really all we looked at. And we didn't look at how Native Americans, one, lived before, two, the immediate and long-term effects of colonization, and then going forward from there, and how do we allow these people to try to live their culture within the nation that they occupied before any European got here. And that can be difficult to do at times. Where I work in Davis, it's a little bit easier, but in some areas you might get a little bit more pushback, not just from the students themselves, but from parents. Mm-hmm. And so that is something that's a tricky thing to maneuver. Mm-hmm. But we have a lot of great teachers around this state that are doing just that. And I think that we really need to take a second and appreciate what they do, because the area I work in, it's much more open-minded, where other places you might get some static. And from being a teacher, that can be quite intimidating. However, I think it really speaks a lot to the determination of these educators who are taking cultural responsibility in these matters. And so thank you so much for appreciating this. And but I really want to put forward as well other teachers that are doing the same.
Yes. I'm really grateful.
Oh yeah, as well.
The teachers. And I liked what you said, taking responsibility. Mm-hmm. Like collective responsibility. And I also want to go back to something else you said about mass. I just love that you said mass cultural appropriation. and leads to mass information and mass misunderstanding and mass not getting to know, and and that ignorance can turn into fear and hatred and violence. And one area that comes to my mind is I just really appreciate when community members, anybody from anywhere, notices something and addresses it. And I will de-identify any example where, and it happens all the time. It's this is just one example of dominant members of dominant white culture having African themed parties, and how damaging that is to, we think about like the primary damage being the people who are primarily misunderstood. Like there's such a strong association between Africa and wild animals.
Yeah.
That there's so much not looking at the people. That's just one part, and there's layers and layers and nuances, but there's so much that's so offensive and hurts our children, and in different ways. First, the most targeted, I would say the most personally hurt, but it hurts all of us, right? It hurts all of our children, our collective children, because it hurts to, if I raise my children to be ignorant and keep perpetuating. But it just goes back. It just causes harm to everyone. But one recent incident of an attempt to have a African themed party was interrupted because people gave people feedback, and the original, and let's just say party throwers, heard it, and they responded well, and said, wow, we're not going to do that now. And I just feel like that's kind of goes under the, what to do list, which again, we can say more about what things we can do. But I really actually want to draw out some more examples again, before we go to appreciation.
Oh, absolutely.
And I have some myself, but I wanted to ask you, because you're willing to talk about your own heritage and your grandmother being 100% Korean. And you use a term that I really, I just think is another way of educating us. You said undercover, you're an undercover Asian.
Yes.
Right, because you pass as white, just like I'm half Lebanese, but I pass as white. So I have white privilege also, unlike.
Exactly. Yeah.
So did you ever hear any, can you give examples of when people had no idea that anyone who had any Asian heritage was in the room, of exploitation around Asian people? Or
so growing up in Davis, there's a pretty large Asian population, and so in terms of cultural appropriation, not a terrible amount, but what I did definitely experience was racist undertones, if not overt racism, where so I grew up in Davis, and UC Davis has a high Asian population. And so from either my friends or growing up, some of my coworkers, I would definitely hear very racist comments about them. And everything from the just textbook bad drivers, poor personal space skills, I guess you'd call that. And I would have to pipe up and be like, I think that's really offensive. Like my grandmother was Korean. And I just think that those are very, very, very outdated stereotypes. I think you find bad drivers everywhere. I think come to Sacramento. They are everywhere. But Davis. Not so much. Not so much cultural appropriation in that case. But it's definitely different when people think that they are in a space where they can speak like that and really feel like they don't have consequences. And so for me, I always felt very offended by that, because I took that pretty personally. You're talking to me, you're talking about my grandmother, you're talking about my family, you're talking about my dad, you're talking about my brother, you're talking about my sister. And so I always took that sort of stuff personally. Same thing for a homophobic behavior. My brother is a gay man, And so when I hear that sort of stuff, to me, it's like, dude, like, you're really coming after my family, and not just that, but like a massive portion of our population. And so I definitely grew up around that as being, as you said, an undercover Asian. But in terms of appropriation, I didn't experience a terrible amount of that. But at the same time, growing up, that wasn't exactly something I was looking for.
Mhm.
So I could have experienced that, and it just went soaring over my head, as many things do. Even
That's
yeah,
that would be true for many of us,
yeah,
especially those of us who are not pushed to the margins, and because we've had access to things, we're more unable to see what it's like when we don't have them because we're so
yes,
used to them, we take them for granted. But I do want to mention, because I was oblivious too, and of course I still am, and who knows what, maybe tomorrow I'll find another level of my obliviousness, because I do, there are stages, and it's continuous, from it's lifelong. I might be really aware in some arenas, but not in others arenas. But one thing that struck me this summer was, in the past, years ago, I have a friend who, like, having a family from, even though there's all kinds of Arabs and there's all kinds of different Arabic food, there's different Arabic dialects, there's different Arabic religions, right? There's all
mhm,
kinds of variety, just like any people, right? There's all kinds of, it's a continuum of diversity even within one group. But what I learned about belly dancing, it was a dance for women, by women for women,
mhm,
and taught many things. And there's all kinds of stereotypes about that, and all kinds of um, the way it's treated sometimes is disturbing, in the media, and the ignorance and the stereotypes, and so for me, of course, it was really disturbing to see it again. The media is so good at taking things out of context and exploiting people, but on a personal level, a friend of mine, even um, who's a beautiful, let's just say, performer,
okay,
a type of artistic performer.
yeah,
And we even had a discussion about, and about, this person even said to me, "Well, I'm not sure how you feel about this. Thanks for coming to my performance, but I do use belly dancing in this." And I said, "Oh, well, oh, okay," which surprised me. And then I watched it, and at first time, it was years ago, and I did share that. It made me feel very uncomfortable for the very
mhm,
reason that it's out of context, and it's,
yes,
to me, misleading. It's I don't know whether she makes money or not, or out of this. I don't know. If she does, we could add, maybe it's a form of exploitation. But then again, years later, somehow I minimized it and I let it go. We're still friends. I don't write people out of my life. I like to communicate and
yes,
learn from each other and share what it feels like. And anyway, years later, I saw her do the performance again. And I think because of more awareness over time, and less numb, because I think part of being able to perpetuate biases and be oblivious is, because is involves numbing out our feelings, like, it's
yeah,
for right. So I guess I've become less numb, yay.
yeah,
Because I saw it again recently, and I actually felt it really viscerally, really, really viscerally. Like, I could not watch it. I had to. I could not watch it. It just felt so. I think, especially knowing we've had conversations, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
explicitly stating, that it's not just me, it's me, my family, people, countries.
yes,
And that's probably part of it, is because it was, and I think of so many people from different minorities who explicitly, whether it's, collectively or individually, or in communities, or through, letter writing, have said, this is a form of exploitation. Please do not take this element of our culture and try and use it. But it is, we've yet to reach a level where we can relax about that.
yes. I gotta say, like, it's really hard, especially when someone's your friend. Like, if it's a perfect stranger, I am far happier being a little bit more aggressive about that sort of a thing. But when it's your friend, someone that you know, someone that you enjoy, whose thoughts about you matter to you, like, that can be really tough to do. And it's, again, it's another very difficult thing to maneuver, where I can't say that I figured that out myself. You know, like that can be very tough. At the same time, it doesn't mean it's any less, as you said, like viscerally disturbing. You know, just because it's someone you know, it almost makes it worse. You know, because you would think that they would think about those sort of things as well, but unfortunately, you know, people are people and they don't sometimes, and so that can be very difficult. And as you were talking about that, there was something about my grandmother that made me think about this, is that it sounds like you have a pretty good cultural understanding of your heritage, where my grandmother actually refused to teach my father Korean, wouldn't teach him anything about Buddhism, with the idea of, I want you to assimilate as fast as humanly possible. And so it worked. Like my dad doesn't speak a word of Korean, speaks perfect English, is not a Buddhist, not a religious person whatsoever, for that matter. I think he learned who Jesus Christ was when he was in his early 20s from my Catholic mother. And I mean that seriously. That's not a joke. Like, I don't, like, per him, like, he had no idea what that was. He was aware of Christianity. He didn't have any idea of any of the major players. But because of that, my father and myself, and by extension the rest of my family, really lost a lot of our cultural identity from that, which is something that I'm pretty upset about. Like, I would have really enjoyed that, and I would have felt more connected to my grandmother as well. Like, I loved my grandmother to death. Don't get that twisted. But it definitely was a disappointment, and more of a disappointment as I get older. You know, like as a child, it wasn't something I thought about because I was busy playing baseball and playing football and hanging out with my friends and going skateboarding. But now, as I get older, the more and more I want to know about her, where she came from, the more and more it hurts. And so that might be another reason why growing up, I just didn't notice certain forms of appropriation, because my father was assimilated, and therefore I don't have that knowledge of my grandmother's culture. And so I hope I didn't take that off the rails there. But
no, that's so relevant and so important. And thank you for sharing that. And I think that's I know that's true for many people. And likewise, my father, I think, was afraid to teach us Arabic because he was afraid. And he also had a thick Arabic accent. And once he opened his mouth, people looked at him really differently, even though he had a PhD and spoke 5 languages, because he sounded like a foreigner. People just, all of a sudden, it was okay to be condescending to him.
Yeah,
he was
that's always great. Yeah,
he was like a neurophysiologist, neurobiologist, but it was hard to take how people would mistreat somebody in your family. But likewise, he didn't teach us Arabic. What a loss! Just like you said, what a loss! And watching him speak, to people from all over the place, it's what a gift it is, right? When you know at least one other language, especially when that's part of your heritage.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I don't mean to change subject, but I did want to circle back to something that you talked about earlier, which was that Africa party that was going on. And while its initial idea, especially from an outsider's perspective, you could be like, wow, like, what were you thinking? Like, what was going through your head when you thought this? But something I do want to, I give them credit for, is taking critical feedback and running with it.
Yes.
I think that is very admirable, and it kind of underlines, innocent ignorance. I'm not sure if it was innocent ignorance, but it does. But from the reaction, it does sound that way, to where they thought they had a good idea, and then it was pointed out, no, in fact, this is a terrible idea. Yeah, but they were able to look in that mirror and be like, oh man, like, oh God, like, you're right, like, we can't do this. And they took responsibility, they called it off. And I think that it deserves praise. And because I'm sure you've had this experience. I think everyone in the world has had this experience. And if you hadn't, you're a very lucky person. But a lot of people, when they're called out like that, have a tendency to dig their heels in and sort of double down.
Yes.
And that is, 1, natural, 2, unbelievably frustrating, because now you've just had a completely closed mindset. Not to use the teacher jargon there, but you have a very closed mindset, to where now your ability to actually take in information and make a critical decision about it is gone. We're not being rational anymore. Now we're trying to win an argument. Whether or not you're rationalizing anything is totally irrelevant. You're just trying, to win. And so I really think that the people that called off that party grew. And I think that, if they have another opportunity to maybe do something around these lines, they do something more respectful, and probably would be a good idea to get the community involved in terms of potential ideas. And I think that's another thing as well, is just if you're going to try to have some sort of themed party like that, you should probably talk to people from that culture to see if what you're doing is highly offensive. So I'm happy to hear, or cultural appropriation, not just offensive. There's many things that are offensive that it's not cultural appropriation. But yeah, I do want to give them some kudos for that, of like they actually listened instead of going the other route, which is so easy to do.
Yeah. And I give credit to the people who did sort of, to use a phrase from Loretta Ross, to call them in rather than call them out.
Yes. Oh, I like that. I never heard that before. I like that a lot.
Yeah, and not like I have never. I mean, in my over 25 years of doing this work, I never believed it, long before there was the word cancel. Never believed in canceling people, right? Just like my friend, she's still my friend, because it doesn't make the world better. It doesn't make the world better.
Oh, I totally agree.
Yeah, and to it really helps how you give people feedback. I mean, well, just that you give people feedback. Sometimes it comes out imperfectly, but yes, anyone who responds without reacting and defending and doubling down is definitely doing the right thing, and good modeling for what many more of us could be doing.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. And again, I don't want to take this in a different direction, but something I do like to stress is I feel like that's something that currently, as in the United States, we're doing a lot, especially with political alignment. And I don't want to take this to a different direction, but I feel like that's something that is more of an issue now than ever. Is like, oh, you're like, if being a Democrat, saying to like someone who's a Republican, like, man, I don't know if I could be friends with you because you're a Republican. Mm-hmm. And to me, that is just so toxic. Like, you can have political differences and still be friends. Now, of course, if you're a outspoken racist, then yeah, we're going to have issues, and I really don't want to talk to you very much. Mm-hmm. But small things, or political things can be large as well, but just getting along with people that think differently. And as long as they're on the same tracks as you, which is, I'm just trying to do what I think is right and makes this society better for everybody. I don't see why you can't be friendly with people that differ with you in certain views. And I feel like that's a major issue in today's culture, at least in this country.
It really is. I've never seen anything like it in a long time. That's why I love studying history, to like, oh yeah, like who was it, Hegel, who talked about synthesis, and then something happening historically, and then there's an antithesis, and then there's a thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. Like, things happen in movements and waves, and because it could be easy to think, oh my God, we've never been in this horrible place and we'll never get out of it. But I do think knowing our history helps us a lot, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And helps us, hopefully, like, even though it doesn't feel like it sometimes helps, hopefully it's true. It helps us not repeat the worst part. Although right now we feel like, oh, wait a minute. I feel like some of the worst parts are maybe being repeated. But
yeah. Hopefully we're at that cusp to where we'll start.
More. And I'm referring to what, in my point of view, there is some mass misinformation dividing people. But in my point of view, and I feel for people who will dig their heels in defending something when they actually really, really believe it's the truth.
Yes. Yeah.
Although it is our responsibility to look at and hopefully access different sources of information. I mean, it's on us to educate ourselves. When those, we're not in school anymore, there's a lot of different ways to learn, like by getting to know people, talking to people, reading, listening to various sources of information, because we are in a dire time of many people being, in my opinion, like following misinformation.
Yeah.
So that I do. I'm glad you brought that up, because I know we're, talking about in your classes, you're talking about midterm elections and
Yes.
democracy and how it works. And related to this, I wanted to ask you, like, because I am also of the point of view, like, realizing, wow, is our democratic system really at risk? Are we actually at risk? Like, I'm getting nervous about, like, more states putting in barriers to vote, like the redistricting, and I'm paying a little bit more attention. And I know everybody has busy lives, and we're raising children, or we're this thing and working, and sometimes working 3 jobs. It's hard to keep up with everything, but I'm getting glimpses of, like, some of the barriers that are being put up now to make voting even harder, which is extremely painful and discouraging. When, so, you think of John Lewis, and the march over the Selma Bridge, and all, all the civil rights workers, working so hard to gain and make voting rights more accessible to more and more people of color who didn't have, so I don't know, just, that's a big broad, I'm asking you a big broad question. So take it where you see fit. Like, what do you see as potentially in danger now, that we could possibly be losing in our democracy?
Oh yeah. So the probably the two most visible ones that jump out to me is restricting mail-in ballots. Not allowing people to do those is very much getting in the way very much getting in the way of our democracy. Because what you're essentially doing is you're taking away people's ability to vote at all, because unfortunately our country doesn't have a holiday on our voting day, which means people are expected to go to work. And a lot of people don't have the ability to take a day off to go to the ballot because they have mouths to feed, theirs and their families if they have them. And so what you're essentially forcing these people to do, you're holding them fiscally hostage. You're saying to them, either you take a day's pay off of your paycheck and go vote, or you get the money that you need to survive and you lose your political voice. And so to me, that is something that I feel is a major impediment to democracy in this country, is getting rid of mail-in ballots in a lot of places and really pressing in-person voting. If in-person voting is really that important, then it would make the most sense to have multiple days and holidays. Now, and so that is one big one that I would see getting in the way of our current democracy. And we're seeing big pushes for that. I mean, Trump really pressed that during the election of in-person voting. And then afterwards, he tried to use mail-in ballots as a weapon to perpetuate the lie that the election was fraudulent. And so we see a lot of rhetoric going on with that, absentee ballots. And so that is one that I very much think is getting in the way of our democracy. In addition to that, we don't really need to go too much in this, but just putting validity of elections on blast where there is no evidence to show that. I don't want to make this like just a Trump bashing session, but but when they asked him, like, how do you feel about this election? He said, like, I'm either going to win or the election was fraudulent. And that is just a dog whistle to a lot of people that are more on the extreme side, I guess you would say, of conservatism. But that is also growing as well as extreme politics. And so that is a huge one. Gerrymandering, of course, is another, next to absentee ballots. If you're trying to find out, the will of the people in a certain area, then the area needs to make sense. And so I don't want to pick on him politically, but if you look at Dan Crenshaw's district in Texas, I believe, I'm sorry for what I just said that name and I feel like I got it wrong. The politician who was a veteran who lost his eye in combat. As far as someone who I differ with politically, I actually really like his character. I think he's a good person. I don't like a lot of his policies, But if you look at that guy's district, it is a ridiculous shape. Like I don't understand it. I would kind of describe it as almost like a crescent moon sort of thing that has a lot of jagged edges. And that is not a way to run a railroad if you're trying to find out the feelings of people in a certain area. And let's be honest, like, this is the United States. People from county to county have different ideas. People from town to town and from district to district. And the only way to really make that a true representation of democracy, if you have districts that make sense and you're not playing a political game just to figure out, okay, how can I win an election if I have 30% of support? And I could just redraw these lines in a way to make it so I can still win this. So for me, gerrymandering, I don't understand how it's still legal, to be honest with you, because I wouldn't even call it an open secret. It is a very well-known political tool that's been being used for a very long time. And so I feel gerrymandering does get in the way of democracy heavily. And then one that I feel gets overlooked a lot, that I feel pretty passionately about, is requiring identification when voting. Most people do have valid identification. So actually, for most people, it wouldn't be an issue. But there's a ton of people out there that very much qualify to be, or that are voters that don't have identification. Like, I don't think that you should not be able to vote if you're homeless. Like, you definitely still have a political voice. In fact, how homeless people may vote could be far more impactful to them in the immediate than you, me, or someone else. Mm-hmm. And so I don't feel that most homeless people have a what we would say a proper form of identity. I'm using a lot of air quotes today. Have a proper form of identification. But guess what, man? Like, not having property and not having, being on the streets, that doesn't disqualify you from being part of the electorate. And if you look at a place like Los Angeles, or the Los Angeles area, they have 50,000 people who are homeless. And, I feel that they should all be allowed to participate in our democracy. And so I feel that requiring identification is a very subtle yet effective tool to stop people from voting, and thus getting in the way of our democracy. Those are probably the big three that stand out to me right now off the top of my head. Are gerrymandering, requiring identification, and making mail-in ballots less accessible, and requiring in-person voting on a day that you don't have off from work that will impact you fiscally. A lot of people just aren't in the position, going back to the mail-in ballot, aren't in a position to make that financial sacrifice. Yeah.
No, I appreciate all of those points. And if we are registered, then we have at some one point or another shown or proved our citizenship, and exactly. That we have the right to vote. It could be circumstances. And I know a lot of the many people who don't have homes and live outside on streets are there because of trauma. There are certain percentages. I don't have the statistics memorized at this point in time, but at one point, I think up to 60% were veterans.
Yeah.
Like PTSD. And I know that when I used to work in the domestic violence field, there were many people who were fleeing from violence, and sometimes you don't have a place to go, but they were still U.S. citizens and had registered to vote. And it is really a sad shame to lose your voice when you're most disempowered or least empowered.
Yeah, especially when you sacrifice so much for your country, and now that same country is trying to take away your political voice. Like that's pretty terrible, And so, yeah, no, my hearts go out to them. And like that is a massive injustice politically, for sure, and socially, obviously. But yeah, no, to me, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If you claim to have a country that is a democracy, then you need to include people and not actively look to exclude. True, we don't have literacy tests anymore. And if you haven't taken a look at some of those, this isn't just to you, but also to the listeners. Like, if you haven't taken a look at some of those literacy tests, it has nothing to do about being literate. It's a test that's made to fail.
Mhm.
And in fact, I use literacy tests in my class to where I say, if you pass this test, you have an A+ in my class, and you don't need to show up ever again. Like because it's not it's all subjective. If I want you to fail, you're going to fail on the first question, and you have to get all the questions right. But yeah, no, it's fraud.
Incredibly unfair. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I think it's in the book called The Magic, or Behind the Magic Curtain, and based in some history in Birmingham, Alabama. And again, not to stereotype Alabama, and there are a lot of subcultures in Alabama that are working very hard for inclusion and voters' rights, and just like there are in any state. But it talked about how difficult these like fake literacy tests were given to people of color, to particularly Black, African American, brown-skinned people, and how many people it just disabled their ability to vote.
Yeah.
And I think it is, and thank you for mentioning those 3 or 4 factors, because it is sort of hard to believe, again, when people are working hard and long hours and also have other responsibilities, it's hard to keep up with what has happened. Like this gerrymandering thing is just kind of mind-blowing. How rampant and barriers, and I lost track of how many states are like opposing or sitting at barriers, making voting more difficult. It's just so mind-blowing after the hard, decades of civil rights work, or like from the suffragists, before that. And it reminds me of that. I think one of sort of the big shakeups in the last few years, especially when there are people who, and I know not every listener would be agreeing with me, but there are elected officials who are perpetuating the lie that the previous presidential election was fraudulent, which is so factually time and time again has been proven that it was legitimate, recounted, legitimate. So it's just kind of mind-blowing that this is where we are. And the word integrity is coming to my mind because, and of course I'm not the first or last person to say this, but democracy depends, I think we're now realizing how much democracy depends on integrity.
Going off
you can't operate if we don't have a basic amount of decency and a basic amount of respect for the principles and practices that are the foundation of this country, none of which are perfect, but which we're working toward. So anyway, what did you want to say about integrity? Please add.
So, I mean, it's a very small thing, but on January 6th, one of the pieces of integrity that I found to be very admirable was after the insurrectionists stormed the Capitol, started looking for Senate members for ill intentions, we'll say, that the senators, once the insurrection was quelled, instead of taking time like a day or so to count those votes, they went right back in there and counted the votes. And to me, that was a symbolic show, and that made me, on a bad day, it made me feel better, and so I really enjoyed that. I don't know if enjoyed is the right word, but appreciated that, of we're not going to let these people call the shots. And truly, they were insurrectionists. They were trying to stop a democratic process because it was going to produce an outcome that they didn't like. And guess what? This is a democracy, dude. You're going to have outcomes that you don't like, because that's kind of how this works. And so that is something that I've wanted to point out, was senators going back in there and counting those votes day of. And so,
that is true.
Yes.
And so critical. I hate to think what would happen if they hadn't been so committed and collectively held on to that integrity. Although not everyone there voted.
All senators are super down with our democratic ideals. They're quite vocal about that. Unfortunately.
Well, it's incredible. I mean, I just feel like it's so easy to take this country for granted. It's so easy, especially when we've had the protections and we don't know what it's like to not have them.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, self-explain to kids. Like, dude, you grew up with this. I grew up with this. Like, you go someplace else and see how they function. And I'm not saying the rest of the world is like this horrible place where this, that, and the other. In
No.
fact, most countries have democracies with rights and protections and all that good stuff. But you take a look at Russia. Where if you speak out against the government, you are running a serious physical risk.
It's
I know we're running low on time, but there was this one segment I really this group of young female protesters in Russia protesting against the war. They were arrested for their protest and taken to this police station. Many of them were beaten. And this, I did try to. I'm not entirely sure what they were trying to get out of these people, but one young woman had a plastic bag put over her head, and they would start essentially suffocating her for 30 to 40 seconds at a time. This is for protesting. This is something that we do, that we see as a very naturally given right, where in a lot of places it's not the case.
Okay, well, Aaron, thank you for your closing thought.
Yeah, sorry to end on a high note there. Very, very uplifting stuff. But yeah.
No, I really, really appreciate your being here, and there's so much more to cover. But I thank you for helping drawing this out, and for your time, because I know it's very precious. And I also want to thank the listeners and viewers for tuning in. I really appreciate our engineer DJ, our producer Dean Piper, and be sure to tune in next Wednesday at 8 p.m. to It's Your Voice, 8 p.m. Eastern Time on W4CY.com or Talk4TV. And may we all have enriching conversations this week.
Inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech